Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, July 28th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is August 2nd. Each Tuesday, we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information on what the lead-off person would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sarah Mickelson.
Bill Hall.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton, and our friend Sarah Mickelson is the lead-off person, so it's all yours, my friend.
Thank you for joining us this morning, and we are continuing our conversation about Matthew, or presented by Matthew. We've been spending some time in the 13th chapter. We now have moved to the 14th chapter of Matthew. Jesus has just received word that John the Baptist has been killed by Herod in the court at a banquet. And that's where our story picks up. So Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the villages and buy the food for themselves." And Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said to them, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowd. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And that ends our reading. Charles? You got anything?
Just a couple of, yes, thank you, Sarah. Just a couple of brief observations to put in. First is in our report, because I did not actually go back and confirm it by going through all 4 Gospels, but this is, according to the reading that I did, the single event, the single kind of a report of a miracle like this that is reported by all 5 of the Gospels. And as it appears, the basic thread would have been created by Mark, the earliest of the 3 synoptic gospel writers, and then worked with and used by Matthew and Luke. John, in his own way, goes about it, but he also includes the same discussion of Jesus and the multiplication of the food. The other side comment is that it has to do with the characterization of the 5,000. And the Mark, the original source of the story, and the written version of it, as we have it, only says there were 5,000 men. Matthew, the gospel that we're treating today, says that there were 5,000 men besides women and children. And Luke simply omits that observation, doesn't report any number at all. John reports 5,000. So a lot has been made about the fact that women and children were included only as an afterthought, as a kind of a sign of the relatively low degree of value in the overall societal world of women and children. And yet, if you think about it, whether the loaves were able to serve all 5,000 because Jesus created that much more food, or as some thoughtful people said, well, it meant that they had to finally look within themselves and found they had enough to go around and even more besides. But if you think about it, it would have been the women who would have been carrying that extra bread. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. I like that. I like that phrase. You know, Charles, not to put too fine a point on it, but the way the sentence is phrased, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So it's interesting that the women and children seem to be the primary subject, and the 5,000 men seem to be the secondary subject of that phrase, which is a reversal of how social structures at that time treated children and women. So in our thinking this week, I posed 3 questions. They're kind of long, so bear with me. After talking over the past 3 weeks about seeds and soil, weeds and wheat, seeds maturing, transforming into fruit-bearing plants, Jesus presents us with this miracle story. Jesus desires solitude, and I wondered about the processing of the death of John, but his desire is stalled by the crowd. He sees that they are also responding to the death of John. And I'm remembering Jesus' words that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. This compassion for the crowd moves Jesus to heal, to teach, to serve the crowds that are following him. What does this inform or affirm about the nature of Jesus Christ and God? Don, you look like you're awake. Would you like that one?
Well, thanks for noticing that I'm awake. I appreciate that. And, yeah, I'll take a crack at it. First, what helped me is how compressed this chapter is. Only 36 verses, and you gave a little background of what's happened. John the Baptist has been seized, bound, imprisoned, executed. This also has Jesus showing compassion, the feeding of the multitudes, Jesus alone in prayer, Jesus walking the water, and more. So if you said, look, I'm gonna have a chapter in one long book, and somebody said, well, what are you going to put in it? I'd say, well, I thought I'd put in fear, compassion, justice, storms, prayer, hunger, fear, all in one chapter? Yeah, I think I'll put it all in one chapter. And that's difficult. Matthew's very difficult, but we are in the time of pandemic, and we have layered issues right now in our lives. And if you're watching after a pandemic, a reminder where we are. And so compression is real. You can go on about your business, getting food, going about cooking, going about getting the food you need, and something happens. Someone beloved is taken. Someone is accused. Someone is killed. You learn about things. You need to flee. You need to seek out someone that unifies you. So I just wanted to highlight what is, for me, awkward sometimes, but I think meaningful here, because in the middle of this, the human spirit seems to be one in many ways after they learned about the death of John. So I'm just going to highlight, Sarah, in the middle of this is common needs, shared grief, shared fear, shared staging, shared logistics, which is a miracle in itself. Charles and I can debate. I'm going to, just for the purpose of storytelling, if 5,000 plus the rest, I'd say that's 20,000 people. I'll fill up a basketball arena. I'll fill up an NBA stadium. Shared staging, shared logistics, shared compassion, because I think compassion was needed to draw out those, and shared seeking. There's two analogies to other parts of the gospel I wanted to make, that when Jesus sees this and stops, I think, Sarah, that's what you're looking for, stopping along the way. He has other business to do. I'll put out that he is seeing the church, the future church. He has to stop because he's seeing what's being prepared. He's seeing what grace is going to do. And grace is already breaking through now. He can't help but stop because you're seeing the future church. This is how the church works. Logistics. What drives you to the door of the church? Fear, seeking, loss. It's the church, and they're there together. And then the other analogy is it's a desolate place. They're driven there by something that they all have in common. And I want to hold out Jesus being driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. They're driven to a desolate place. So for the 21st century, church, present, instead of talking about our individual needs today, I'm going to say collective needs, collective logistics, collective fear, collective grief, and all being driven to a desolate place. And it turns out the church is there. So that's my best shot, Sarah.
Thank you. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. First of all, and I will speak to your question about, in effect, who is Jesus Christ and how are we to serve Christ today. I didn't write it down. One of the commentaries that I referenced drew an interesting point that I'd never thought of. And we've acknowledged before, we cannot today get inside Matthew's mind or the gospel writer's mind. So whether or not what I'm about to say was intentional on the gospel writer's part, or it was just the way things happen. But in this chapter, there are two banquets. There's Herod's birthday, and there's this church picnic. And the difference could not be more compelling. Herod's birthday, surely we can assume only the elite were there, and it was all about entertaining, which leads tragically to the death of a good person. It led to destruction. Jesus's banquet, if we can call it that, was nurturing, even of women and children. So I think there's something there. Jesus isn't at Herod's birthday party. Jesus is out grieving the results of that banquet. And as you've noted, Sarah, he's in effect intruded upon. That tells us something, that Jesus was interruptible. This isn't the only time where we're told he goes to the other side of the lake and the crowds follow him. And you don't have to be a minister or in a helping profession to understand that often our kids' phone call needing help comes at an inopportune time. That's a part of the human condition. But I think that's a part of the nature of who Jesus Christ is and who we are to be. And he's interruptible at first, perhaps we could say by curiosity, then by human need. And one of the commentaries I particularly like is Frederick Dale Bruner, in which he offers his own translations. And the New Revised Standard Version says that Jesus had compassion for them and cured their sick. Bruner translates it as Jesus' heart went out to them and he healed their wretched ones. A more forceful way of saying it. I'm not saying one is right and the other is wrong. It's the difference in nuance. That gets at the nature of Jesus Christ. He had compassion for them. You think about it, and maybe this was implied in the disciples' response. One could fault the crowd. What were you thinking? You go out there and you don't take provisions for yourself. But my impression is this goes on longer than anybody expected. It's like night is creeping up on them. And in that regard, I don't know if this will show up. I showed this recently. It looks backwards on my screen. Father Greg Boyle works with gangs in South L.A., and the quote, in case you couldn't read it, is sooner or later we all discover that kindness is the only strength there is. There's another quote from Father Boyle. Now, mind you, he's dealing with, if I may use this language, the worst of the worst. He's done hundreds of funerals for gang members. He deals with violence almost every day and with human need. And his quote is, "Here is what we seek, a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it."
Love that.
Yes. Compassion for what they have to carry rather than judging them for how they carry it. And to me, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have any frustrations at times with those that he seeks to serve. But I sense in this, one could say, well, these people were ill-prepared or foolish or whatever. Jesus says they're hungry. He sees that need and responds. And I mentioned this pre-recording session. As Charles has noted, this is in all four Gospels, and I think for a reason. Almost if we knew nothing else about Jesus, we would have a lifelong commission as a follower of Jesus Christ based on this story.
I agree. Charles, do you want to add anything?
Yes, just I guess this is, I would call them stones along the way. If you think about this picture, there's a certain element of unreality to it. These people came from all over, and the comment that the disciples suggested, they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves. That doesn't occur to us as a strange thing. But if you think about it, there weren't any 24-hour grocery stores in Palestine at that time. I mean, if it's gotten dark, that meant that everybody's gone home. There are no stores that are open for people to go in there and buy food. It's just as I was thinking about it, it doesn't come together as a reliable possibility. The second is that in the earliest of the three gospel narratives, the synoptic gospel narratives that we have, Jesus taught them first, then it became late, then he said the hour's way, tell them to go away in the countryside and the villages round and about and buy themselves something to eat. Well, once again, that couldn't have happened, but because there would not have been any place open, the people who would have been running the shops would have already been either out there on the field with everybody else, or they would have all gone home. There would have been no shops to go and get something. So there's an unreality to it. But I guess my main concern is to point out that in the original text, Jesus taught them as well as healed them, and that's something that Matthew, for whatever reasons he had, decided to leave out of the text because it was not to his main point, which was that Jesus had compassion upon the multitudes and was able to provide provision for them as well as healing.
Thank you. So I guess I enjoyed this visual picture that Matthew gives us. I was reminded of how after 9/11 in our country, people were drawn to churches, and we gathered, and in our churches, I would put our church as a fairly large church, but I remember there not being any seats available because so many people were looking for an anchor in what seemed to be a chaotic storm. And so my heart remembers that moment, and I guess the word is I can transfer that idea or that image into the words that were given from Matthew today, and I can see these people feeling so unsettled upon hearing about the tragic death of John and the brutality in which he died, and the fact that he was a truth teller. And that was the thing that provoked his imprisonment and his death. So I would see this as a very unsettling time. I agree with you, Don. There's lots of layers to the compressed anxiety of living under the foot of Rome, under the capriciousness of the cruelty that Herod showed. So my heart just leaps a little bit, and I liked the way that Mark Davis talked about Jesus' response to these crowds, and that it was a visceral anguish to work toward the compassion, or to be moved by that compassion, to just reach out to them and start working through the crowd and feeding them not just food, but what they spiritually needed, which was comfort, which was healing, which was acknowledgement, which was inclusion, which was a sense of finding that moment of stability within the storm. And I see that in this particular passage, and that really meant a lot to me. And, I'm not sure that I am capable every time I walk into the room to look at or just survey the room and go, what are the needs in this room? And I'm not well equipped to always be in tune to that. And I think that's one of the things that this story informs or affirms about the nature of God and about the nature of Jesus Christ to me, is that they're looking, Jesus is looking for the need and moves toward it, and works to bring to the community what is needed. And sometimes that's just a matter of, let me introduce you to this person. They know exactly what you need, or let me take this action and we'll put new shoes on your children's feet. It might just be those things. But I think there's some very deliberate importance or lifting up of this compassion. And so I think the compassion is profound. And that's what we're called to do as followers of Christ, is first be compassionate. And there's no judgment here. I like that. Second question. With a nod to Brian Stafford's Crossmarks blog, thank you very much, Jesus asked the disciples to actively participate in meeting the needs of the crowd. The disciples respond to him with limitations and objections and solutions that are based in human nature that an imperial economy could solve. Jesus challenges the disciples with, you feed them. The disciples are asked to shift from being consumers of the miracle into being collaborators in the miracle. And what do you believe the lesson or lessons was or were for them and for us as we seek to be engaged followers of Christ? Bill, you want to play?
I'll step up to the plate. By the way, that I know that alliteration can be problematic, but this consumers of the miracle and collaborators, was that your own invention? That's good, Sarah.
Actually, the word that Brian Stafford used was contributors.
Oh, okay. All right. I did not get to read his contribution. My way of saying it is that the disciples were offered an option. They were apparently most comfortable being observers and commentators and judgers. And Jesus asked them to be active participants in the problem solving. You feed them. I think that phrase is in all four gospel accounts. I don't have the parallels right in front of me. That's a powerful statement. There's a whole message just there. You you feed them. Also, yet again, if I may use this term, the hero of this story is one of the little ones, a boy. Now, we can just slide over that, and we could make too much of it, but who apparently is the one either who said, wait a minute, I've got something to share, or that the disciples, we're not told, just that there was a child who offered what little he had. And there is this issue of the numbers. I don't get wrapped around that. I think even if there's an exaggeration in the numbers, the story is saying, dear followers of Christ, when you are faced with what appears to be an insurmountable challenge, how do you respond? Now, some people, we've got the phrase making a mountain out of a molehill. Some people could see one hungry person and say, what can I do? To me, the numbers are not important. What's important is Jesus saw a need, and this is making a fine point of it. To me, there's no indication that Jesus personally handed anybody any food except the disciples, and they were then to distribute it. In other words, again, they were to be active participants in this. In effect, Jesus is saying, look, trust that the little that is available is enough. I think I've quoted this before on this broadcast. There's an old gospel chorus that's really lively musically that says, little is much when God is in it. I've heard that sung in, I'll put it this way, some worship communities that would seem to be least in the world's eyes. A lot of poor people, not a lot of education. You ought to hear how they sing that song. Little is much when God is in it. So to me, it isn't that the disciples are invited into a kind of grandiosity. You can do anything. It's take what little you have and share it. It reminds me of a verse in 2 Corinthians 8:12, talking about the response to a great need by the churches of Macedonia. And Paul says, if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. You hear that? It's about using what you do have and being willing to share it. I remember several decades ago, and I haven't checked lately to see if this organization still exists. In the Christian church, one of the parachurch organizations was the Medical Benevolence Foundation that raised money to support medical missions around the world. And one of their representatives was speaking at the church I was serving then in Bradenton. And he ended with this story, and he had a picture that there was, I don't know, one of the African countries or somewhere, a time of famine, and there was an organization trying to help people, and they literally had built an enclosure, and they only let in the number of people that they had the resources to feed. A dire situation. The picture is that within the enclosure, there's this little boy who's got some food in his hand, and he walks over to the fence and pushes through the fence a portion of what he has to a little boy or a child outside the fence. And this representative was saying, the gospel is not just that we feed those inside the fence, but we somehow offer it to those that the world considers outside the fence. And one can only dream of what would happen in today's world if that was the spirit with which we approached the human needs that are so obvious right now. Thank you.
Charles, you want to volunteer anything?
Well, these are two observations from outer space. I guess I'll put it that way. The first is that John, bless his heart, John sets this up as a Passover meal because he describes and he's the only one who makes the point or chooses to make the point that this occurred at the time of the Passover, and that was particularly because the way Jesus divided the food and distributed it or had it distributed among the people who were there. And as I said, John makes that the Passover. And what's remarkable about John doing that is that because in John's time, the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. So this is the only time in John's gospel that I can recall where it is set up as a Passover meal, but it comes with respect to the timing of the rest of the gospels. It comes, or the other three gospels, it comes at a different point. The third is, the second point is, and this is again out of the blue and unrelated directly to, well, it is related to the past comments because it occurred to me when Bill was describing the young boy passing. Well, I'm going to make two more comments then. The other is that it's in John and only in John where there's a young child who produces the food that is multiplied and distributed. The gospel writers, the other three gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't say where it came from. They just said that's where it was. And whether they had it, whether they found it someplace else, they don't identify that. John is the only one who says that it comes from a child who was among the population that was there. The other comment was that if you think about it, there would have been no Samaritans present at that crowd, would there? They wouldn't have been allowed there. They would have been shut out, and they would have stayed away because they knew that they were not to be mixing up with Jews, and so they wouldn't have. But there was a kind of a separation, even in this sense of unity. And Jesus, whereas in other parts of the Gospels, he has gone out of his way to recognize and honor the Samaritans. In this particular instance, that would not have been the case. There would not have been Samaritans there. Nor did Jesus say, go out and find some Samaritans to make sure that we have a fully representative crowd of people from this large geographic area.
Thank you,
Boy,
Charles.
that was a downer. You're welcome.
Don, do you have anything?
Well, just a spectrum. If you're facilitating a discussion, you could put out: is this about, on one end of the spectrum, miracle plus distribution, or is it the miracle of distribution? And you can pick any part you want along the way. I think it's perfect. No heresy in any of those choices. But if you go all the way to the miracle of distribution, it's almost like you don't need the miracle in the first place. And I'll just put out on that far end of the spectrum, I would challenge, if there are families present, that anyone would strike out without food and water. And it's just a matter of maximizing what's there by offering up something first, and then what seems to come is a miracle in itself because people are packing some food. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other is the straight-up miracle that there's enough for everybody because of the presence of Jesus. But I think this is about the future church. So you have to have, when you're producing something, a sense of the whole, right? But you also have to know what your personal accountability is. Any organization does that. The military does it. What are we trying to do? What is our mission? But what is your accountability? And it goes to me to the parables last week. The mustard seed, flash forward, large bush. Nothing in between. You have a sense of the seed, and you know what the end game is. Now, fill in the blank with your life. Leaven, bread. It's all, the parable is, for me, about contrast. And so what's happening in the middle? And the examples I could give you would be, I use the word upstream. You're not far enough upstream yet to be meaningful. So, you think you're baking the potatoes, but you're actually supposed to peel the potatoes, or you're supposed to wash the potatoes, you're supposed to grow the potatoes. There's an upstream thing here about where is it taking place towards the whole. It's the same in education. Why aren't we producing more degrees and high school diplomas and college degrees? Well, you need to be upstream. Early learning, nutrition, literacy. Right? I think all those kinds of process things are in this, because it's mustard seed, then the big bush. A product. I'm making widgets. Well, but you have to go way upstream to the idea to make the perfect widget. You have to have the process. So where do you fall in that? If you have a sense of the whole, which is the church, then you have the miracle of distribution. And I think you can have the miracle of distribution without the miracle of, like a kid's sermon, duplicating bread, right? Duplicating fish. It's duplicated because we are one. We're the whole, and you participate in it all along the way. And so wherever you fall on the spectrum, miracle and some distribution, or the miracle of distribution, I think you're going to find the gospel there. And you're going to find the future church there as well, because the more excellent way for Corinthians, the better way, is to think about both of those things. And that takes us back to the parable of leaven and the mustard seed. Okay.
Thank you, Don. I had two thoughts about this, or maybe more than that, but I was reminded that in every culture there is the story of stone soup. This is an old story. I was first introduced to it when I watched Captain Kangaroo. I'm showing my age now. And Captain Kangaroo would tell the story and show us the images of the story that went with this. And the thrust of the story is 3 travelers arrive in a community. The community is completely closed to them. In an effort to establish a friendship and a compassionate relationship with the community, the 3 travelers make soup with a big pot, some water, and some rocks. And they pose to the people as they become curious, what would make this soup taste really good would be some onion or some potato or some mushroom. And as you can imagine, what ends up happening is the entire community starts to volunteer what they have in abundance, and the soup becomes something that can sustain the entire community for a meal, a banquet. So I love that almost every culture has this story. I love that you could travel to Malaysia and hear it in that conversation. You could travel to Europe and hear it in that conversation. You could travel to Mexico and hear it in that conversation. That was my first thought. Second thought is there's this short story by Leo Tolstoy called The Three Questions. And it shows a child inquiring to someone that's perceived to be wise. And his questions are, who's the most important person? When's the best moment to do something? And what should I do? And of course, over time, the wisdom is imparted that the most important person is the person you're with, the person that's in front of you. The most important moment is now, and the most important action is what they need. And I think this story gives us all of those things and inquires or holds us accountable to be the respondent, to be an action taker. And I think that we are often much better at being consumers of miracles, watching from the outside and looking at what the story is going to tell us, instead of becoming a person that sees the story moving forward and invests time, energy, engagement into becoming a part of a solution. I think that's profound. The other thing is we have to be, right, I think, Bill, the word you used was interruptible. And not the person that sits like this at the dining room table and scrolls. But you have to really be willing to put down all that emergent need in your life to listen to the emergent need in someone else's. And I think that's a profound engagement for anybody that follows. So my third question, and I'll be quick because we're approaching our time. Mark Davis notes in his blog, Left Behind and Loving It, thank you, Mark, that in verse 16, Jesus speaks in response to the disciples' thinking, which I called scarcity thinking. And Jesus responds with, they have no need to go away. You give them something to eat. And this poses the idea that where Jesus is, abundance is also. And what are your thoughts about this, and how is this good news both then and now? Don, you want to take this one?
Sure. I'll use the word stay or abide, that there's a better way here. I don't think it's just about carbohydrates and protein. I think the abundance is much more than that. And I go back to this compressed chapter. This is heavy-duty fear. They are driven out of their cities to go to this place to be with him, which means by default they're all together. So it's not just the abundance of carbohydrates and protein, but there's unity. How about rest? And there's the order of the future church right there. So it's not just, I'd say they need, the suggestion that they go out and get food for themselves is a great idea. It's kind of like in the parable 2 weeks ago, we need to pull up the weeds right now, right? And the landowner, no, not now. Well, who's right in a practical sense? Probably the people, who are servants there tending the farm. And I think it's probably right that they go. But in the balance of what the world really looks like in the world of grace, if they go out and search, that's independent anxiety. It's out, and fear and grief continue. There's another agenda. All right, it gets more compressed. And each one has to engage in their own transactions instead of the transaction of fellowships and prayer. They also will have different results, right? Whether we have 5,000 or 20,000, I vote for 20,000. Every purchase, every transaction is going to be different. At the end of this, they're all satisfied. They all have what they need, which I assume is about the same kind of eating. They all have what they need. They all go out, they're not going to have the same thing. Some have some wealth, some can trade, some cannot. Some will go hungry. Some will not have what they need. So Jesus is like, we're not going to let that happen either. And also, if they all go out, they can't see each other anymore. They're not going to one place. So they're going to fan out, and the unity is broken. The need to feed yourself breaks unity. Check it out, right? There's no hierarchy in it at all, and they lose time together. How long does it take for them to sit there and to talk and to rest in a very difficult chapter, in a very difficult chapter of their lives? Is this another hour? 2 more hours of unity? Is it the church picnic that gets to go on all afternoon when before you weren't planning on it? If you've been Zooming all through the pandemic to see your brothers and sisters and everybody you love, wouldn't it be nice not to have to Zoom anymore and to be together? So I think that goes back to that is the more excellent way. Yes, practically speaking, they should go out and get fruit. But the more excellent way is, what are we doing? What is the higher objective? What is the mission? And what is your role in it? Your role is to stay. And if you pick on the spectrum what I pick, it's also, don't you have some food too? Let's see what we can all do together.
Yeah. Thank you, Don. Bill?
I'll begin with a quick, recent true story from my circle of family and friends. Several months ago, a niece and her husband in the Orlando area experienced the destruction of their home. She was out shopping. Her husband was working from home. suddenly a neighbor bangs on the door and screams at them to get out. And as our nephew is rushing across the street with his two small boys, the roof just explodes, literally explodes in flames. The fire had started up in the attic. And where the room he'd been in, had he been there another minute or two, the ceiling had collapsed. So he's standing there watching his house go up in flames, and his wife drives up from her shopping trip a few minutes later to see fire trucks battling to stop the blaze. I'd never experienced this. I've always been a little skeptical about this GoFundMe business. Within about an hour, a neighbor had set up a fund saying, look, they've got insurance, but we all know that doesn't cover everything, and set a goal. Within less than 48 hours, it was significantly overfunded by about 50%. And if you've ever done it, this was a first for me. Now, you can hide what you give, but many people, you could see what they gave. There were some larger amount. Mostly it was $10, $20, $50. And it was a powerful experience of abundance. This was a first for me, and I sort of sat in awe watching this unfold. And then I was able to talk with my niece and her husband separately later, and while they didn't initiate that, it really had an impact on them. And not surprisingly, that money has proved to be very, very helpful, because insurance doesn't cover everything, and there's a delay. It will basically fund the rebuilding of their home. It turns out they're going to be able to, but they'll be about a year getting back in. So I think that this issue of scarcity and abundance is absolutely relevant today. Again, I always caution, it's not about grandiosity. Grandiosity would be trust. It's the prosperity gospel. If you have enough faith, you will have the wealth that I have. It's not about that kind of abundance. It's that there is enough already. There's enough food. There's enough shelter. There's enough caring. And, in this story, it's tempting to slide over or rush past the fact that feeding hungry people is not the only miracle in this story. He healed their wretched ones. But that was only part of the crowd. And I think that's, again, yes, there are people with obvious immediate needs, but everyone has a need. Now, maybe I am expanding this story too much. Fortunately, obviously, if you look at me, I don't go hungry, but there are other needs that I have for meaning, for purpose, for community. And to think that Jesus says to us, in effect, notice everybody. Yes, pay attention to the immediate pressing needs, but be aware that everyone in some ways has some hunger. And again, one of my favorite commentators, Bruner, he offers a possible analogy to the sower and the four soils, and suggests that the disciples may be like the thorns, where there's faith, but their anxiety chokes out. It compresses their sense of what's possible, and what Jesus does is expand an awareness of what is possible. And Bruner also makes the point that Jesus doesn't create new food. He takes what's available and distributes it. So it's not the miracle of magically creating a whole banquet. It's taking what is offered and finding that is enough.
Thank you. Charles? You got anything?
Pass. Nope. Thank you, ma'am.
So I'm often puzzled and confounded by this idea of enough. And I think that the questions that pop into my head is, how can I be enough? How can we have enough? Can we do enough? Or enough is enough, which is all part of the conversation here. I love that we are reminded that in and of ourselves, with God's help and God's leadership, we can actually be enough for each other. And sometimes the need is to be engaged. The need is to feel as if you have something to contribute. The need is to be a part of something bigger than yourself. Sometimes the need is more elemental, like hunger or healing or just being a part of something as a group because you felt isolated and lost. Sometimes the wonderful thing that happens is you realize that you can become a part of the story or a part of the miracle. So I love that this particular story gives us a glimpse or an engagement opportunity or a point of entry at all those places. I also think that there's some onus on us to value the abundance in which we function. I mean, what an anomaly to go to the grocery store 24 hours a day and be able to buy anything we need. Now, qualify that at the early part of the pandemic, toilet paper was in short supply. And you would often walk in and there would be no paper products. There would be no flour to make bread. There would be no soup. There would be, nothing. You might find no chicken or no beef. So, we have what I call a short supply issue, distribution issue. But in other parts of the world, it's much more profound. Clean water. Loving homes that people could share with each other that are more than cardboard boxes or 10, corrugated 10. So that those are all things that we can be a part of. And I think that's part of the engagement here is that we are a part of the solution and we don't get a pass. And I think it's important that we don't get a pass because I don't know if you've ever been engaged in something like a feeding program. I know, Billy, you do Habitat for Humanity. But when you are engaged, what you get from it is so much more than what you give to it. And the sense of that you can do something that is life-changing for someone else is so valuable. And then when you realize that your life is the one that changed, not theirs, that makes it even more profound. Charles, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you. I had one, but it was a dark one, and I don't want to darken the mood. I think the mood needs to be upbeat. The mood needs to be to recognize that with Jesus' presence, abundance can be realized.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to recognize and ask: how can we be part of the process of recognizing abundance than by hoarding, make money off of, or make security off of scarcity. That's just it's the way our contemporary minds work. Maybe even the minds of people in those days faced with the same kind of problem. But Jesus is pointing to simply a completely reversal of that process by his presence and by his invitation, making it possible for people to recognize the abundance that they had.
Thanks, Charles. And we're right at time, so For folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening during the time of pandemic, many resources at that site. Other discussions of these passages, so you'll get some other points of view. You'll hear sermons, worship services, music, studies, reflections. So we commend that to you during this time. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.